Geronimo! You've heard it 1,000 times before. Paratroopers shout it as they leap from planes. Kids yell it before cannonballing into swimming pools. It's in movies, video games, even cartoons. A battle cry. A celebration of courage. But have you ever stopped to ask, why? Why do we shout the name of a 19th century Apache warrior when we need courage? What did this man do to make his name immortal? This is the story of how one man made an entire nation tremble. How 40 warriors held off 5,000 soldiers for a decade. How a name became synonymous with fear itself. This is the story of Geronimo, the man before the legend. He wasn't always called Geronimo. He was born WWII in 1829, which translates to one who yawns. Not exactly a fearsome warrior name, is it? He grew up in what we now call Arizona and New Mexico, in a world that was about to be torn apart. The Apache weren't just one tribe, they were several bands, each with their own territories and traditions. Geronimo was born into the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua Apache. They were raiders, warriors, survivors in one of the harshest landscapes in North America. The desert Southwest wasn't just their home. It was their fortress. Every canyon, every water source, every hidden trail, they knew it all. Young WWII was trained as all Apache boys were. Endurance running, sometimes 70 miles in a single day. Tracking and survival. And even combat. The Apache didn't just fight, they perfected the art of warfare in impossible terrain. They could disappear into landscapes that seemed empty, strike without warning, vanish like smoke. By his 20s, WWII had a wife and 3 children, a mother he loved. He was a warrior, yes, but also a husband and father. His life had meaning beyond battle. And then, in 1858, everything changed. The birth of fury. WWII and other warriors traveled to a Mexican town called Llanos to trade. It was supposed to be peaceful. They left their families at camp, women, children, elders, all protected by only a few guards. When they returned, they found a massacre. Mexican soldiers had attacked. His mother, wife, and children were all murdered, along with many others from his band. The camp was destroyed. Blood soaked into the desert sand. Imagine that moment. Imagine coming home to find everyone you love slaughtered. The Apache had specific mourning rituals. They burned the possessions of the dead, spoke their names one final time, then never spoke them again. The grief was meant to be buried. But WWII's grief wouldn't stay buried. It transformed into something else entirely, something that would echo through history. He convinced other warriors to join him on a revenge raid into Mexico. And during the battle that followed, something happened. The Mexican soldiers, terrified by this warrior who seemed possessed, who fought with supernatural fury, began crying out to Saint Jerome, "Geronimo! Geronimo!" begging their patron saint for protection. It didn't help them. When the battle ended, the Mexicans had a new name for the warrior they couldn't kill. They called him Geronimo, and he embraced it. Because WWII, the one who yawns, was dead. Something fiercer had been born. His reputation grew rapidly. Stories spread of a warrior who couldn't be killed, who had visions, who could heal wounds through ceremony and see the future. Whether these powers were real didn't matter. People believed they were. And belief, especially belief in an enemy, is a powerful weapon. The impossible war. By the 1870s, the American government was forcing Apache bands onto reservations, confined spaces with poor conditions, where free-ranging people were expected to become farmers overnight, where rations were often stolen by corrupt agents, where disease spread rapidly. Geronimo tried reservation life multiple times, and he hated every second of it. So he escaped, again and again and again. Each time, he took followers with him, sometimes dozens of warriors with their families. Each time, The U.S. Army was deployed to bring them back. Each time, Geronimo made them look foolish. The final breakout came in May 1885. Geronimo and about 35 warriors, along with women and children, fled the San Carlos Reservation. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable military campaign in American history. The U.S. Army deployed 5,000 troops, 5,000, to catch approximately 40 people. They coordinated with 3,000 Mexican soldiers. They used the newest telegraph technology to track movements. They employed Apache scouts who knew the terrain. They had supply lines, cavalry, the backing of the most powerful military in the Western Hemisphere. And for over a year, Geronimo made fools of them all. Here's what made him so terrifying. First, the Apache could cover 70 miles in a day on foot. Cavalry horses, carrying soldiers and supplies, couldn't keep up. By the time troops arrived at a reported location, Geronimo was 3 valleys away. Second, he knew every water source, every hidden trail, every canyon that could become an ambush site. The Southwest wasn't just his territory, it was his weapon. Soldiers died of thirst pursuing shadows. Third, his raids were unpredictable. He'd strike a ranch in Arizona, then disappear into Mexico where U.S. troops couldn't officially follow. Then he'd pop up 200 miles away, then vanish completely for weeks. The psychological warfare was devastating. Every settler in the Southwest lived in terror, never knowing when Geronimo might appear. And fourth, the stories. Stories of narrow escapes that seemed impossible, of being surrounded, only to disappear overnight, of dodging bullets, and of appearing in 2 places at once. Were all these stories true? Probably not, but the legend fed the fear, and the fear was very real. Newspapers sensationalized every raid. Eastern papers called him the worst Indian who ever lived, and the Apache Terror. His name sold papers because his name meant fear. Parents threatened misbehaving children. Geronimo will get you. He became a boogeyman, larger than life. At one point, a quarter of the entire U.S. Army was dedicated to capturing him and his small band. The financial cost ran into millions of dollars. The political cost was even higher. How could America claim to have conquered the West when one warrior made their army look incompetent? General George Crook, considered the best Indian fighter in the army, tried and failed to capture Geronimo. He was replaced by General Nelson Miles, who threw even more resources at the problem. Miles used heliograph stations, essentially signal mirrors, to create a communication network across the Southwest. He coordinated movements with Mexican forces. He cut off water sources. Nothing worked. Geronimo was always 1 step ahead. So how did it end? Here's the thing most people don't know. Geronimo was never captured. He negotiated a surrender. By September 1886, his people were exhausted. A year of constant running, fighting, hiding. Women, children, elders suffering. And General Miles made promises. "Surrender peacefully," Miles said, "and you'll be reunited with your families." Imprisoned for a maximum of 2 years, then allowed to return to Arizona. Geronimo didn't trust him. He had been lied to before. But he was tired, and his people were dying. And Miles gave his word as an officer. On September 4th, 1886, in Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, Geronimo formally surrendered. He was the last Native American warrior to formally give up armed resistance to the United States government. With him, the Indian Wars effectively ended. The famous photos were taken, Geronimo, still defiant in his gaze, standing with his warriors. The most wanted man in America, finally in custody. And then came the betrayal. Every promise was broken. Geronimo and his people weren't sent home after 2 years. They were shipped to Florida as prisoners of war. Geronimo would never see Arizona again. Many Apache prisoners died in Florida from disease and the humid climate they weren't adapted to. Families were separated. Children were sent to boarding schools designed to erase their culture. But here's where the story becomes strange. Geronimo, the fearsome warrior, became a celebrity. He was moved between prison camps, Florida, then Alabama, then finally Fort Sill, Oklahoma. But the government discovered that people would pay money to see him. So Geronimo appeared at exhibitions and fairs. In 1904, he was displayed at the St. Louis World's Fair, selling photographs and autographs. In 1905, he rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. The man who had terrorized the Southwest was now a tourist attraction. The irony is almost unbearable. Geronimo, who had fought for freedom his entire life, spent his final years as a living museum exhibit. He died in 1909, at approximately 80 years old, from pneumonia after falling off his horse. He died at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, still technically a prisoner of war. His dying words were reportedly regrets about surrendering. He wanted to die in his homeland. He never got that wish. So why did Geronimo become America's most feared name? It wasn't just because he was a brilliant warrior, though he was. It wasn't just because he evaded capture for so long, though he did. It wasn't even because of the violence of his raids, though those were real and devastating. Geronimo became feared because he represented something America couldn't control. He was the embodiment of resistance in an era when resistance was supposed to be over. He was proof that the conquest of the West wasn't complete, wasn't clean, wasn't the inevitable march of progress it was sold as. Every time he escaped, he reminded the nation that their victory was built on broken promises and stolen land. Every raid was a wound in the narrative of American expansion. And narratives, when threatened, fight back with fear. The newspapers didn't just report on Geronimo, they needed him to be a monster. Because if he was just a man defending his people, his land, his way of life, well, that made the story more complicated, didn't it? But here's the remarkable thing. That fear transformed into something else. When World War II paratroopers started shouting Geronimo as they jumped from planes, they weren't invoking a monster. They were invoking courage and defiance. The refusal to surrender even when the odds are impossible. Geronimo's name outlived his people's freedom. It outlived the nation's fear. It became a symbol of the very thing that made him dangerous. The courage to leap into the unknown, to face impossible odds, to keep fighting when surrender seems inevitable. When you shout Geronimo, you're not celebrating a killer or a saint. You're invoking the spirit of a man who lost everything, who fought with everything he had, who refused to let his name be forgotten. America took his land, his freedom, his people, and his life. But his name, that became immortal. And perhaps that's the greatest act of resistance of all. Follow us for more history stories.